The most superior bony structure in the body, and as a whole is composed of the bones of the skull, excluding the mandible. And the cranium has several cavities and sinuses, so is therefore largely hollow. And we're going to be focusing on the largest of these cavities, which is the cranial cavity. The borders or the walls of the cranial cavity are formed by 8 cranial bones that make up what's known as the neurocranium, the part of the skull that contains the brain. So let's look at the cranial cavity from some different aspects now to get a better appreciation of this space. So first, we're going to be looking at the top of the skull, and this is called the calvaria. And the calvaria is made up of the superior portions of the frontal bone, the paired parietal bones, and the occipital bone. And these bones make up the superior border or the roof of the cranial cavity. Looking now from a superior view at the base of the neurocranium, we can see that there's a lot going on. There's lots of foramina, which are holes in the cranium through which arteries, veins, and nerves pass, in addition to spaces which are known as fossae. And the most notable of these foramina, of course, is probably this one here, which is the foramen magnum, which we mentioned earlier. The bones that make up the floor of the cranial cavity can be divided quite nicely into 3 fossae, and these are the anterior, middle, and posterior cranial fossae. The anterior cranial fossa, just behind the forehead, is comprised of 3 bony elements: the orbital plate of the frontal bone, the superior part of the ethmoid bone, and the lesser wings of the sphenoid bone. The middle cranial fossa is similarly formed by 3 bones. They're the body and greater wings of the sphenoid bone, the paired temporal bones, and the inferior-most portions of the paired parietal bones. And finally, towards the back of the head, the posterior cranial fossa is comprised of the temporal bone, the paired parietal bones, and the occipital bone. So just to recap, the bones that make up the borders of the cranial cavity were the frontal bone, the ethmoid bone, the sphenoid bone, the paired parietal and temporal bones, and the occipital bone. So what lives inside this bony space then? Well, it's pretty common knowledge that the brain lives there, the brain being composed of the cerebrum, the brainstem, and the cerebellum, of course. But surrounding the brain are a number of protective layers, so let's take a peek at this illustration to get a good look. So we're now looking at a coronal section of the skull cap, or calvaria, where we can see the skin and subcutaneous fat of the scalp here, superficial to the bone, and it's the parietal bones that we can see here. The longitudinal fissure is running through the plane of the image between the hemispheres of the brain. Underneath the bony walls of the cranial cavity, there are 3 protective layers of tissue, and these are the meninges. From superficial to deep, they are the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. The dura mater is a double-layered strong membrane, and it is adhered to the bone and contains the venous or dural sinuses between its 2 layers. The middle meningeal layer is called the arachnoid mater, and it's a thinner membrane that covers the brain and has fine web-like projections that connect it to the deeper pia mater below, which are known as the arachnoid trabeculae. And it's between these 2 layers that cerebrospinal fluid circulates, and this fluid cushions the movements of the brain within this bony cavity. The pia mater is a very delicate, thin layer of protective tissue that is so closely attached to the surface of the brain that it can't be removed by dissection. The cerebrum, the cerebellum, and almost all of the brainstem are contained within the cranial cavity. The caudal part of the medulla oblongata peeks out the foramen magnum into the vertebral cavity. Okay, so that's it for the anatomy of the cranial cavity. Let's follow that brainstem into our next